The once great kingdom of Eloria was crumbling under the weight of an encroaching darkness. For weeks, the sun had barely pierced the sky, its warmth fading into a cold twilight that seemed to stretch into eternity. Crops withered in the fields, animals grew restless, and the people, once proud and resilient, whispered of ancient evils and forgotten curses. All eyes were drawn to the distant horizon where an ancient tower, long thought to be abandoned, now glowed with a strange and sinister light. It flickered in the distance like a dying star, cold and malignant, as if mocking the very essence of life. In the heart of the kingdom's capital, the royal palace had become a shadow of its former self. The grand halls, once filled with the laughter of courtiers and the vibrant hum of political machinations, were now hollow, suffused with an oppressive silence. At its center, King Aldrich sat upon his throne, his gaunt face pale and etched with the weariness of a man whose time was running out. His health had failed as surely as the light in the sky, and it was whispered that the king, too, was bound to the fate of the sun. On this fateful evening, the king had summoned a group of warriors, his last hope. In the throne room, dimly lit by sputtering torches, the warriors gathered before the king, their armor catching the dying light in odd reflections. Each was handpicked from a different guild, representing the most skilled and capable fighters in the kingdom. Yet, despite their prowess, an unspoken tension hung in the air. They could feel the weight of the unknown pressing against them, the silent terror of the mission before them. "I see the doubt in your eyes," King Aldrich rasped, his voice like brittle parchment, barely rising above a whisper. He leaned forward, his skeletal hand gripping the arm of his throne as if to steady himself. "But you must listen, for I have little time left. This kingdom has thrived under the light of the sun for centuries, but now it withers. That cursed tower you see on the horizon, it is the source of this blight. A light so unnatural, so cold, emanates from it, draining the warmth from our world. It will swallow us all if it is not stopped." His words echoed through the chamber, but none dared to speak. The warriors stood silently, some gazing at the king with a mix of sympathy and unease, others staring straight ahead, their faces unreadable beneath their helms. One among them, a tall, broad-shouldered warrior clad in battered iron, spoke at last. His voice was low, a rumble of thunder in the oppressive quiet. "What do you know of this tower, your grace? It is said to be abandoned, yet something within still lives." Aldrich's gaze shifted to the warrior, and for a moment, a glint of something flickered in his eyes, fear or perhaps regret. "It was once a place of study," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "In the days when magic was not yet a thing of fear, sorcerers from across the lands gathered there to learn the mysteries of the world. But something went wrong. The tower was abandoned, or so we believed. Now it shines once more, but with a light that brings only death." Another of the group, a lithe figure wrapped in dark leather, stepped forward. Her face was partially hidden beneath a hood, but her sharp eyes gleamed with curiosity. "If this light is draining the world, why now? What caused this sudden awakening after so many years of silence?" The king's gaze dropped to his hands, trembling as they rested on his lap. "I do not know," he admitted softly. "I only know that it must be stopped. I have sent others before you, but none returned. You are the best, the last hope for this kingdom. Should you fail—" His voice trailed off, leaving the words unsaid, but the meaning was clear. Should they fail, Eloria, and perhaps the world would be swallowed by the creeping shadow. The silence that followed was heavy, as each warrior wrestled with the enormity of the task before them. The king's frail figure, slumped in his throne, seemed already like a specter of death, and it was hard to shake the feeling that he knew more than he had said. The leader of the group, a grizzled knight named Varian, stepped forward. His face was hardened by years of battle, and his eyes, though steely, carried the weight of experience. "We will investigate this tower, Your Grace," he said, his voice steady. "But you must know, this is no ordinary mission. We are walking into the unknown. What we face could be beyond even our skill." Aldrich nodded, his face drawn and haggard. "I know, but you are all I have left. If there is any hope, it lies with you." As the warriors turned to leave, the king's voice called out one last time, weak but determined. "Take care. The light, it is not just a beacon. It will try to consume you. Resist it, or you will become part of the darkness." The group exited the throne room in silence, their footsteps echoing through the empty halls. Outside, the once thriving streets of the capital lay still and empty, as though the life had been drained from the very stones. A bitter wind swept through the streets, carrying with it the chill of impending doom. Each warrior walked with a heavy heart, their thoughts consumed by what awaited them. Varian, the veteran knight, could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on him, his mind flashing back to battles fought and comrades lost. The mage, Alara, muttered incantations under her breath, her sharp mind racing through the possibilities of what they might encounter within the cursed tower. Behind them, the assassin Leoric moved silently, his every step measured, though even he could not shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap woven long before they had ever drawn breath. As the tower loomed ever closer in the distance, its strange light flickering like a taunting flame, they each felt it, the unshakable sense that their lives, and perhaps the world itself, hung in the balance. Doubts gnawed at their minds, and for the first time in many years, they each feared not just failure, but the unknown horror that awaited them in the tower's dark embrace. And so began their journey into the twilight, toward the light that promised nothing but death. The road to the tower was a narrow, winding path that cut through the once vibrant forest of Elderglen, now reduced to a skeletal remnant of its former self. The trees that lined the road stood twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like withered claws, long dead from the encroaching darkness that had plagued the land. The air was thick with decay, and the soil beneath the warriors' boots felt brittle, as though it would crumble to dust with each step. There were no birds, no rustling of leaves, only an unnatural silence that pressed down on them like a heavy shroud. Varian, at the head of the group, kept his hand close to the hilt of his sword, his senses heightened by the eerie stillness. He could feel the unease in his companions as well. Alara, the mage, walked quietly beside him, her eyes scanning the barren woods, her hand glowing faintly with a protective charm. Leoric, the assassin, moved as silently as ever at the rear of the group, his dagger ever ready, though the ominous silence seemed to cloak even his movements in a strange, oppressive weight. "This place was once a haven for travelers," Varian said, his voice barely breaking the suffocating quiet. "Now it feels like the dead themselves avoid it." Alara nodded, her brow furrowed. The forest was consumed by the darkness from the tower. The magic here, it's unnatural, twisted. I can feel it in the air, suffocating everything. Leoric, always one to find humor in even the bleakest of circumstances, muttered from behind, "We're not dead yet, though this place makes me wonder if we're already in the afterlife." Varian gave a short, humorless chuckle, but the tension in the group was palpable. The path before them seemed to stretch endlessly, as though the forest itself conspired to prolong their journey. There was no sun, only the dull gray of a sky that seemed perpetually locked in twilight. Above them, the tower's light pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat, distant but ever-present, guiding them like a cursed beacon. As they ventured deeper, the silence grew heavier, and with it came a growing sense of unease. Then, without warning, the stillness was shattered. From the shadows, something stirred. The first sign was the sound, barely a whisper, of something moving through the underbrush. Varian raised a hand, signaling the group to stop. Alara's fingers crackled with latent magic, ready to unleash a spell. Leoric, ever watchful, melted into the shadows, his dagger gleaming. "What is it?" Varian whispered, scanning the trees. Alara's eyes narrowed, her voice tight with concentration. "Something unnatural. It's close." As if summoned by her words, a low growl resonated from the darkness beyond the trees. The ground shifted, and from the dead forest emerged creatures unlike any they had ever seen. Their forms were twisted and unnatural, once wolves perhaps, but now warped by the absence of light. Their fur was patchy, matted with decay, their eyes glowing with a sickly yellow hue. Their teeth, long and jagged, gleamed as they bared their fangs at the intruders. "They've been touched by the tower's magic," Alara whispered, her voice filled with dread. Without hesitation, the creatures lunged. Varian's sword flashed in the dim light as he parried the first strike, his blade cleaving through the wolf-like creature's twisted form. The beast howled, its body collapsing in a pile of ash and bone as if it had never been whole. Alara stepped forward, her hand thrusting forward with a sharp incantation. A bolt of arcane energy surged from her palm, striking another of the creatures with a crackling explosion of light. The beast disintegrated in a burst of foul-smelling smoke, its essence consumed by the spell. Leoric moved with deadly precision, his dagger finding the weak points in the creature's malformed bodies. Each strike was swift and final, but no matter how many they felled, more seemed to emerge from the shadows, as though the darkness itself was birthing these horrors. "They're endless," Leoric growled, dodging a swipe from one of the beasts. "They're drawn to the light of the tower," Alara said through gritted teeth. "It's corrupted them. We need to move. Staying here will only bring more." With a final slash, Varian dispatched the last of the immediate threats. His chest heaved as he looked around at the ash-covered ground where the creatures had fallen. "She's right," he said, sheathing his sword. "We need to keep moving. The longer we stay in one place, the more of these things will come." They pressed on, deeper into the forest, the twisted creatures now a constant threat lurking at the edges of their vision. As the day, or what passed for it, waned, the already dim light faded further, leaving them in a near-complete gloom. The pulsing light from the distant tower was their only guide. When they finally made camp for the night, it was in a small clearing, barren and devoid of life like everything else in the cursed forest. Varian set a watch rotation, though none of them expected to sleep peacefully. As the first watch passed, the unnatural silence pressed in once more, broken only by the occasional rustling of unseen creatures in the distance. When Alara took her place at the watch, she sat near the dying embers of their fire, her mind troubled by the journey ahead. The tower's light flickered on the horizon, a reminder of the darkness they were moving toward. "You seem troubled, mage," Varian said as he joined her by the fire, his eyes scanning the forest. He had long given up on the idea of sleep. Alara sighed, her hand tracing idle patterns in the dirt. "There's something old about this magic. It's not just darkness. It's part of something bigger, something ancient." Varian frowned. "You've sensed it before?" "In the old texts," she said, her voice low. "There were legends, fragments of stories. Really, about an order of sorcerers who believed that the world cycle had to end in darkness. They claimed that the sun was a finite resource, that its light was never meant to last forever. They called themselves the Order of Dusk." Varian shifted uncomfortably. "And you think this tower is connected to them?" Alara nodded. "It's possible. The light we see is not life-giving. It's draining the world of its vitality. If the Order of Dusk still exists, or if someone has revived their magic, then we may be facing something far worse than we imagined." The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows that seemed to dance with the uncertainty of her words. The night stretched on, and with it came dreams, or rather nightmares. Each warrior was visited by visions of a world where the sun no longer rose, where the sky was swallowed by darkness and the earth became a barren wasteland. They saw themselves walking through an eternal twilight, their bodies withering under the weight of a cold that seeped into their very souls. And always, at the center of it all, was the tower, its light growing ever stronger as the world around them died. Varian woke in a cold sweat, his hand instinctively reaching for his sword. Across the camp, Alara stirred, her eyes wide and haunted. Leo Rick, ever the silent shadow, sat awake, staring at the horizon where the tower's light still pulsed, its rhythm now unmistakably in tune with their own beating hearts. "We all saw it," Alara said quietly, her voice trembling with the weight of what they had experienced. Varian nodded grimly. "The tower is calling to us. Whatever waits there, it knows we're coming." And so, with the first hints of another gray dawn breaking through the cursed sky, they gathered their belongings and set off once more. The dark road stretched ahead, leading them deeper into the shadows, toward the tower that held the fate of their world within its cold, flickering light. The journey had been long, filled with the silent dread that clung to them like a second skin. But now, at last, the tower stood before them, a looming monolith of black stone that seemed to warp the air around it. The landscape leading up to its base was barren, as though the earth itself had withered away under the influence of the unnatural light that radiated from its peak. No vegetation grew here, and the ground was cracked and desolate, as if scorched by some invisible fire. Even the sky above the tower seemed wrong, twisted into unnatural hues of sickly green and gray, with clouds moving in chaotic, swirling patterns that defied the winds. The warriors stood at the base of the tower, gazing up in silent awe and terror. "It feels alive," Alara whispered, her eyes wide as she took in the structure. Her voice barely carried, as though the very air around them had thickened with a suffocating force. "I can sense the magic woven into the stone. It's old, older than anything I've ever felt before." Varian's hand gripped the hilt of his sword, his knuckles white beneath his gauntlets. He had faced many enemies in his time, men, beasts, even the undead, but nothing had ever filled him with the same primal dread that this tower now stirred in him. "This place is wrong," he muttered. "Nothing about it feels real." And it wasn't. The tower, though it appeared solid, seemed to shift in subtle ways when they weren't looking. A pillar that had been to their left a moment before would now be on their right. The steps leading to the entrance seemed to stretch and shrink, as if mocking their attempts to reach it. The architecture defied the laws of nature, bending space in ways that made the mind ache just to comprehend. Leo Rick, ever the skeptic, frowned as he stepped closer to the entrance. Illusions, no doubt. Whoever controls this place wants to confuse us before we even step inside. More than illusions, Alara corrected, her voice tight with unease. It's as though the tower itself is bending reality, warping our perception. It's not just in our minds, it's in the fabric of this place. As they climbed the steps, each of them could feel the oppressive weight of the tower pressing down on their spirits. The air grew colder with each step, and a faint, high-pitched hum filled their ears, like the distant wail of something in pain. Above them, the light at the top of the tower pulsed faintly, casting a dim, malevolent glow across the stone. It was no longer simply a beacon. It felt like a wound in the sky, raw and festering, oozing dark energy into the world below. Varian reached the heavy stone doors first, his hand resting on the cold, smooth surface. He hesitated for a moment, feeling the weight of the decision before pushing them open. Inside, the air was thick with the stench of rot and decay. The walls of the tower were lined with ancient carvings, depicting scenes of long-forgotten rituals, dark figures bowing before shadowy deities, their faces twisted in worship and despair. The floor beneath their feet was uneven, the stones worn and cracked as if they had been walked upon for centuries, though no living soul had entered in generations, at least none who had returned. "It begins," Alara murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. As they ventured deeper into the tower, the oppressive atmosphere grew heavier, pressing against their minds. Each step felt like walking through a fog, their senses dulled, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with a low, constant hum that frayed their nerves. The hallways twisted and turned in impossible ways, sometimes looping back on themselves, sometimes leading into dead ends where only moments before there had been a clear path. Then the illusions began. At first, they were subtle shadows moving at the edge of their vision, flickers of light where there should have been none. But soon, the distortions grew more intense. The walls around them shifted, their shapes warping into grotesque faces that sneered and leered at them. The ground beneath their feet seemed to ripple like water, and the air itself thickened, as though they were wading through some unseen force. Varian blinked, and suddenly he was no longer in the tower. He stood in a familiar place, a battlefield long ago, littered with the bodies of his fallen comrades. The stench of blood and death filled his nostrils, and the clang of steel on steel echoed in his ears. He could feel the weight of his sword in his hand, and the cold wind of battle on his face. Before him, a figure rose from the mass of bodies, a man he had once called brother, slain by his own hand. "No," Varian whispered, his voice trembling. "You're dead." The figure stepped closer, his eyes hollow and accusing. "You killed me," the man said, his voice a rasping echo of the past. "You left us all to die." Varian's heart pounded in his chest as the weight of guilt crushed him. He had fought for so long to bury these memories, but now, here, in this cursed place, they rose again like specters from the grave. He could hear the screams of the dying all around him, feel the blood on his hands. But it was a lie. With a great effort, he forced himself to remember. This was not real. It was the tower, feeding on his fear, his guilt, his regret. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, centering himself, grounding his mind in the present. When he opened his eyes, the battlefield was gone, replaced by the cold stone of the tower once more. Varian! Alara's voice cut through the haze, bringing him fully back to reality. He turned to find her standing in front of him, her face pale and drawn. "The tower is playing tricks on us," she said, her voice trembling. "It's feeding off our fears, our memories." Varian nodded, still shaken by the vision. "It's trying to break us." Leoric, who had been silent until now, spoke up, his voice grim. "It won't have to try hard if we keep letting it into our heads. We need to stay sharp, or this place will drive us mad before we even reach the top." The group pressed on, but the tower was relentless. Each room they entered seemed designed to break them. In one chamber, the walls closed in crushingly tight, until the air itself felt like it was being squeezed from their lungs. In another, they were surrounded by mirrors that reflected not their faces, but the faces of those they had failed, each reflection a grotesque mockery of their past. Worst of all were the voices, whispers that seemed to come from the walls, the floor, the very air around them. They spoke in tongues both familiar and alien, mixing truth with lies, feeding their deepest insecurities, their darkest desires. The tower knew their secrets, and it reveled in them. For Leoric, it was the voice of an old master, the one who had betrayed him, offering power in exchange for his soul. For Alara, it was the voice of a teacher long lost, whispering forbidden knowledge, tempting her with the very magic she had sworn to resist. Varian felt the weight of every death he had ever caused, every decision that had led others to ruin. The tower reveled in it, twisting his memories, distorting them until he could barely remember what was real and what was illusion. By the time they reached the heart of the tower, they were shaken to their core, their minds frayed by the relentless assault of fear and doubt. Yet, they pressed on, for beyond the twisted halls, beyond the illusions and nightmares, they could feel it, the pulsing light at the top of the tower, growing stronger with every step. It called to them a promise of something terrible, something final. And in the darkness of the tower, they knew that whatever awaited them would test not just their strength, but their very souls. The climb had taken its toll, but at last, they stood before the final door. A massive slab of ancient stone, etched with strange, twisting runes that seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light of the tower. Beyond it, they could sense the heart of the tower's power, the source of the light that had called them across the cursed land. Varian's hand hesitated on the door's surface, feeling the cold, thrumming energy that radiated from within. Alara stepped forward, her face pale, her eyes focused on the runes. "This magic, it's ancient, older than anything I've encountered. Once we cross this threshold, there's no turning back. The source of the tower's power is on the other side." Varian nodded, his grip tightening on his sword. "We finish this." Leoric, his ever-present smirk now absent, simply nodded as he readied his blades. "Let's hope whatever's in there bleeds like the rest." With a final, deep breath, Varian pushed the door open. The chamber beyond was vast, impossibly so, as though the tower itself had warped space to house this final room. At the far end, bathed in a faint, sickly light, was a woman. No, not a woman. She was something far older, far more powerful than any mere mortal. Draped in tattered, dark robes that shimmered like the night sky, the Witch of Dusk sat upon a throne of twisted stone and shadow, her pale face illuminated by the glow of the light above her. The light, it hung high above her, a sphere of brilliant yet dying energy, pulsing like a dying heart. Its light was weak, but still powerful enough to cast long, twisting shadows across the floor. It was not the golden warmth of the sun, but a cold, sickly imitation. A stolen light that felt more like a wound than a source of life. The witch opened her eyes as they entered, and a slow, knowing smile crept across her face. "So," she said, her voice soft and echoing through the chamber, "the heroes have come at last. I have been waiting for you." Varian stepped forward, his sword drawn, the light glinting off the steel. "We've come to end this," he said, his voice hard. "Whatever you're doing, it stops now." The witch's laughter was soft and melodic, but there was a weight to it, a heaviness that seemed to press down on them like the weight of centuries. She stood from her throne, moving with a grace that belied her ancient age, her long fingers brushing the air as though she were drawing threads of power from the very light above her. "End it?" she said, her smile widening. "You do not even understand what it is you face. This is not a simple spell, a curse you can lift with a swing of your sword. I am not some petty sorceress bent on personal gain. I am the Witch of Dusk, the last of the Order of Dusk. I am the steward of this world's twilight." Alara stepped forward, her eyes locked on the witch. "You've been draining the sun," she said, her voice trembling with both awe and anger. "You've stolen its light to fuel your power." The witch inclined her head. "Yes, I have taken what remains of the sun's strength, drawing it into myself to extend my life and my magic. But you misunderstand me, little mage. I do not take it out of greed. The sun is dying, as all things must. Its light is not eternal, and its time is nearly at an end." Varian's heart pounded in his chest. "You're lying." The witch turned her gaze to him, her dark eyes gleaming with something that might have been pity. "Am I? Look around you, warrior. The land is already withering. The sun's light grows weaker with each passing day. This world is entering its final days, and nothing you do can change that. You think you can stop me? But what will you do? Will you bring the sun back to life? Will you halt the march of time itself?" Alara's voice was sharp, filled with defiance. "If you had not drained the sun's power, perhaps we could have found another way." The witch shook her head slowly. "No, child. You are naive, and your understanding of magic is incomplete. The sun's death was written in the stars long before you were born. I have merely accelerated what was inevitable. I take its light not to destroy, but to preserve. Without me, the sun would flicker out entirely, and the world would be plunged into an endless, cold darkness far worse than what you see now." Varian's grip on his sword tightened. "You think we should just let the world die?" The witch's expression softened, as if she were speaking to a child who could not grasp the truth. "It is not a question of allowing or preventing, warrior. The world is dying. That is the natural order of things. Every cycle must end. Life gives way to death. Light gives way to darkness. The Order of Dusk understood this. They saw that the sun's light would one day fade, and they prepared for the world's twilight. I am the last of that order, the last guardian of the dusk." She paused, her gaze sweeping over them with an almost maternal sadness. "If you kill me and stop this ritual, the sun will not return to its former glory. It will continue to fade, but at a much faster pace. The darkness will come sooner, and with it, the end of all life. What little light remains will sputter out, and the world will be plunged into a cold, eternal night. Alara took a step forward, her hands glowing faintly with arcane energy. And what if we let you live? What if we allow you to keep draining the sun? The witch's smile returned, though it was tinged with sorrow. If I am allowed to continue, I can extend the sun's life, at least for a time. The world will not be saved, but it will have a few more years, perhaps decades. But in the end, the result will be the same. The light will fade, and the darkness will claim everything. A heavy silence fell over the chamber as the truth of her words settled over them. The weight of the decision was crushing. "She's manipulating us," Leoric growled, his daggers glinting in the dim light. "This is just another trick. She's trying to make us doubt ourselves." But Alara shook her head, her eyes wide with realization. "No, she's telling the truth. I can feel it. The magic. It's too ancient, too deeply entwined with the sun itself. She's not just draining its power, she's delaying its death." Varian looked between Alara and the witch, his heart heavy with the enormity of what lay before them. His instincts screamed to strike, to end the threat that the Witch of Dusk represented. And yet, was she truly the enemy? Was she merely the harbinger of an unavoidable fate? The witch, sensing his indecision, took a step closer, her voice soft, almost pleading. "I do not ask you to join me. I ask only that you understand. The world's twilight is coming, and there is no escaping it. Whether I live or die, whether the sun fades slowly or is extinguished in an instant, the end is inevitable." Varian's breath caught in his throat. And what of hope? What of finding another way? The witch smiled, a sad and distant smile. "Hope is the light that blinds us to the truth. There is no other way, warrior. Only the dusk." The room fell silent once more, the only sound the soft, rhythmic pulse of the dying light above them. Each of them knew what had to be done. But the question remained, what choice would they make? To kill the witch and hasten the world's end, or to let her live and extend the twilight for just a little longer, knowing that darkness was inevitable either way? The choice was theirs, but the weight of it threatened to crush them all. The witch's words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of an ancient truth that none of them had been prepared to hear. The chamber was silent save for the faint pulse of the dying light above, casting long, flickering shadows across the stone floor. Varian stood at the center of the group, his sword still drawn, its blade trembling in his grip as the enormity of their situation settled over him. For a long moment, no one spoke. Finally, it was Leoric who broke the silence, his voice sharp with frustration. "This is madness," he snarled, pacing across the chamber like a caged animal. "We can't trust a word she says. She's playing with our heads, trying to make us doubt ourselves. We came here to stop her, to save the sun, and now we're standing here like fools, listening to her lies." Alara shook her head, her voice calm but filled with a quiet intensity. "She's not lying, Leoric. The magic she's using, I've studied spells like this before. I can feel it. This ritual is connected to the sun itself. If we kill her, the light will fade faster." Leoric stopped in his tracks, turning to glare at her. "So what? You're suggesting we just let her keep draining the sun? Let her sit here and play goddess while the world withers away beneath her?" Alara met his gaze evenly. "I'm saying we have to think. This isn't a simple choice. If we kill her, the world could fall into chaos even faster. If we let her live, we buy ourselves time. But the world will still end," Varian finished, his voice hoarse. He sheathed his sword slowly, the weight of the decision pressing down on him like a mountain. It's just a question of when. The Witch of Dusk stood silent and watchful, her dark eyes gleaming as she observed their struggle. She had said her piece, and now it was up to them to decide. Varian felt a cold knot of fear tightening in his chest. This was not the battle he had expected. He had come here to fight, to destroy a great evil and save the world from darkness. But now he was faced with a truth far more complex and far more terrifying. This was not a battle of swords and steel, but of morality, of choices that had no clear right or wrong. Leoric spat on the ground, his expression one of pure disgust. I say we kill her. She's no different from the monsters we've fought before. Just another villain hiding behind pretty words and illusions. The sun is fading because of her. End her, and we end this nightmare. Alara shook her head, her brow furrowed in thought. And if we kill her, what then? The world might plunge into darkness faster. Maybe we have time to find another way. There are ancient magics, forgotten rituals. Perhaps we can restore the sun, or at least slow its decline. Leoric scoffed. And what if we can't? What if we waste our time chasing after lost hopes while the world crumbles around us? Hope is all we have. Alara snapped, her voice rising for the first time. If we give up now, if we take the easy path and kill her, then we've already failed. There's always a way, Leoric. We just have to find it. Varian's gaze shifted between them, torn between their arguments. He could see the truth in both of their words. Leoric, ever the pragmatist, saw the witch as a threat to be eliminated, a danger that could not be allowed to persist. Alara, the idealist, believed that there was still hope, that they could find another solution if only they had more time. But time was not on their side. Leoric, Varian said quietly, what if she's right? What if killing her only makes things worse? We might be damning the world to an even faster death. Leoric's jaw clenched, his hands tightening around the hilts of his daggers. And what if letting her live is just prolonging the inevitable? You heard her. She believes the world is meant to die. You think she's going to help us find some magical solution? She wants the sun to fade. She's part of the problem. Alara stepped forward, her eyes pleading. But what if she's not? What if she's the key to understanding this magic, to finding a way to stop the sun from dying completely? She's lived for centuries, Varian. She knows things we don't. If we kill her now, we lose that knowledge forever. The tension in the room was palpable, a silent pressure that threatened to explode at any moment. Varian ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. He had led men into battle before, had made decisions that had cost lives. But this was something else. This wasn't just about life or death. This was about the fate of the entire world. And no matter what choice they made, there would be consequences. Enough, he said finally, his voice firm. We're not going to solve this by arguing. He turned to the Witch of Dusk, who had remained silent throughout their debate, her expression unreadable. What happens if we let you live? If we allow you to continue draining the sun's light? The witch's gaze softened, and for the first time, there was a hint of something like sorrow in her eyes. If you let me live, I will continue to draw what remains of the sun's essence. The world will grow colder, darker, but it will not die all at once. I can extend the twilight for many years, decades, perhaps more. But the end is inevitable, warrior. Whether you kill me or not, the light will fade. Varian's heart sank at her words. No matter what they did, the outcome seemed the same. The sun would die. the world would fall into darkness. It was only a question of when. But, the witch continued, her voice softer now, in the twilight, there is also a chance for rebirth. The world as it is may be dying, but something new could emerge from the darkness. Life finds a way, even in the absence of light. Varian stared at her, trying to make sense of her cryptic words. Rebirth? What do you mean? The witch smiled faintly. The cycle of life and death is not linear, warrior. It is a spiral. Darkness is not the end, it is a beginning. If you allow the world to slip into twilight, there may be a chance for something new to rise from the ashes of what was. Leoric let out a bitter laugh. You expect us to gamble the fate of the world on your riddles? You speak of rebirth, but all I hear is more death. The witch's smile faded, her expression growing solemn. I do not ask you to trust me. I ask only that you understand. The choice you face is not one of victory or defeat. It is one of time. Whether you kill me or allow me to continue, the end will come. But how you face that end, that is up to you. Varian felt the weight of her words pressing down on him. A crushing realization that there were no right answers, no clear path to salvation. They were standing on the edge of a precipice, with the fate of the world teetering in the balance. I don't like it, Leoric muttered, his voice low. But we can't stand here forever. We have to make a decision. Alara nodded, her eyes filled with uncertainty. Whatever we choose, we do it together. Varian took a deep breath, his mind churning with doubt, fear, and hope all at once. This was not the fight he had trained for, but it was the one that had been placed before him. And now it was time to decide. Whatever happens, he said quietly, we'll face it as one. The choice loomed before them, dark and uncertain, as the shadows of the tower stretched long into the night. The air in the chamber was thick with tension, the weight of their impending choice pressing down on each of them. The Witch of Dusk watched with an unreadable expression, her dark eyes gleaming like twin pools of shadow. Varian stood at the center of the group, his mind reeling, every option they faced feeling like a step closer to doom. They had come here to fight a clear evil, but now the lines between right and wrong had blurred beyond recognition. Then came a voice, calm, smooth, and laced with something darker than uncertainty. I say we make the witch's offer, said Cain, the quiet assassin who had traveled with them from the beginning. His voice broke the silence like a blade through flesh. His expression was impassive, his hood casting a shadow over his sharp features. Varian turned to him, frowning. What are you talking about, Cain? The witch is manipulating us. You can't seriously be considering her offer. Cain's lips curled into a faint smile, his eyes cold and calculating. I've been considering it since we entered this tower. We've been living in a dying world for years, Varian. Every step we take, the light fades a little more. What's the point in delaying the inevitable? The witch has a plan, one that at least offers survival even if it's in shadow. Leoric's daggers were in his hands in an instant, his eyes blazing with fury. You're out of your damn mind, Cain. You're actually siding with her? After all we've been through. Cain didn't flinch. It's not about siding with her, Leoric. It's about facing the truth. The world we know is ending. The sun is dying. Whether we like it or not, the witch's way offers a chance at something different. She promises eternal life, and maybe that's better than watching everything burn out and fade into darkness. Varian felt a cold wave of shock wash over him. He had always known Cain was pragmatic, calculating, even ruthless at times, but this, This was treachery. Alara stepped forward, her face pale with disbelief. You've been in league with her this whole time, haven't you? You knew. That's why you've been so quiet, watching, waiting for the right moment. Kane's smile grew wider, but there was no warmth in it. I've seen the truth, Alara. We all have. I just chose to accept it sooner than the rest of you. This world is beyond saving. The witch offers a way forward, a way to survive. Varian's hand instinctively moved to the hilt of his sword. Kane, this isn't survival. It's surrender. You're willing to damn the world for what? Eternal life in a world of shadow. Kane shrugged, his eyes glinting with cold amusement. What's the alternative? Death? Watching the world crumble around us while we pretend we're the heroes? This isn't a fairy tale, Varian. There's no victory here, no saving the day. There's only survival or death, and I choose survival. Leoric's temper snapped. With a furious snarl, he lunged at Kane, his daggers flashing in the dim light. But Kane was ready. With a swift, fluid motion, he sidestepped Leoric's attack, drawing his own blades in a deadly dance of steel. The two assassins clashed in a flurry of strikes, their movements so fast they seemed like shadows fighting in the flickering light of the chamber. Varian moved to intervene, but the witch's voice cut through the chaos, soft and commanding. Enough! The chamber seemed to shudder with the power in her words. Leoric and Kane froze in place, their weapons still poised to strike, but neither moving. Varian turned to face the Witch of Dusk, his heart pounding in his chest. She stepped down from her throne of shadow, her robes trailing behind her like the dark wings of a raven. "You see now, don't you?" she said, her voice soft and hypnotic. "The world you fight for is already lost. Even your own comrades see the truth. The light is fading, and with it, your hope. But I offer you something more. I offer you a way to live beyond the death of the sun, beyond the end of this dying world." Varian's voice was hoarse as he spoke. "What are you planning?" The witch's smile was slow, almost tender. "I will consume the last of the sun's light," she said, gesturing to the flickering sphere of dying energy above them. "With it, I will plunge the world into eternal twilight, a place where time itself is frozen, where the cycle of life and death ceases to exist. In this new world, there will be no more suffering, no more decay, only stillness, and those who join me will be granted eternal life, untouched by the ravages of time." Alara shook her head, her voice trembling with horror. "That's not life. That's a prison. A world without time, without change. That's not living, it's a nightmare." The witch's gaze shifted to Alara, her eyes filled with something like pity. "You think you understand life, little mage, but you do not. Life is pain. Life is suffering. In the end, all that awaits you is death. I offer you freedom from that cycle. I offer you peace." Varian's hand clenched around the hilt of his sword, his mind racing. "And what happens to those who don't join you? What happens to the rest of the world?" The witch's smile faded, her expression growing cold. "They will perish. The darkness will claim them as it claims all things in the end. But those who embrace the twilight will live on, untouched by time, free from the burdens of mortality." A heavy silence fell over the chamber. Varian's heart pounded in his chest, his mind spinning. He could feel the weight of the choice pressing down on him like a physical force. The witch's plan was monstrous, but it was also seductive. Eternal life, untouched by time. No more suffering, no more death. But at what cost? Leoric broke the silence, his voice filled with fury. "You're insane, Cain. You're really going to throw in your lot with her? With this monster?" Cain's smile was thin. "Call it what you want, Leoric. But I'm not going to die for a world that's already dead." Varian stepped forward, his voice hard. "Cain, we've fought together, bled together. Don't do this." For a moment, something flickered in Cain's eyes, something like doubt. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by cold resolve. "I've made my choice, Varian. Now make yours." The tension in the room was unbearable. Varian could feel the weight of every eye on him. The witch, Alara, Leoric, and Cain. This was it, the moment that would decide everything. The Witch of Dusk stepped closer, her voice soft and coaxing. "Join me, Varian, you and your comrades. I can give you a place in the new world, a world where you will never have to fear death again. Together we can rule the Twilight." Varian's mind churned, torn between the impossible choices before him: betrayal, revelation, and the promise of something more, something darker. The witch's offer was tempting, but deep in his heart, he knew it was wrong. There could be no life in a world frozen in shadow, no peace in an eternity of stillness. His hand tightened on the hilt of his sword as he faced the witch. His voice was steady, filled with grim determination. "No." The witch's smile faded, her eyes narrowing. "Then you have chosen death." The chamber seemed to tremble, the flickering light above them pulsing with a malevolent energy. The final battle was about to begin. Varian knew that no matter the outcome, none of them would emerge unscathed. The shadow of betrayal hung over them all, and the world teetered on the edge of an eternal twilight. But even in the face of certain doom, Varian would fight. He would fight for the light, for whatever remained of it, even if it meant losing everything. The tower shook with a deep, rumbling growl as the warriors made their way to its peak, the very air around them growing heavier with the strain of unleashed magic. Each step they took toward the top felt like a descent into the abyss, not an ascent, as the ancient stone beneath their feet cracked and groaned. The flickering light that had once seemed like a beacon now felt more like a dying star, weak, fading, consumed by the vast shadow that threatened to swallow it whole. Varian could feel the tension pulling them apart. The group, once united in purpose, had splintered under the weight of the Witch of Dusk's offer. Cain stood on the opposite side of the chamber, his face hidden beneath his hood, but Varian could feel the cold betrayal in his eyes. Alara, beside him, clutched her staff with a white-knuckled grip, her face a mask of resolve. Leoric, ever the fighter, was poised with his daggers drawn, his eyes burning with righteous fury. And there, standing at the center of the crumbling tower, was the Witch of Dusk herself. The light she had drained from the sun swirled around her like an ethereal cloak, her presence radiating both beauty and terror. She raised her hands, and the last vestiges of sunlight above the tower seemed to pulse in time with her heartbeat. A steady rhythm of life, slowly being consumed by the dark. "This is your final chance," the witch said, her voice echoing across the chamber like a siren's call. "Embrace the twilight. Let go of the dying light. I can give you a place in the new world, eternal life, eternal peace. You need only submit." Cain stepped forward, his blade lowered but his resolve clear. "She's right, Varian. The world is already dying. We can't stop that, but we can choose how we live in its last moments. We can be more than mortals clinging to the fleeting light. We can be eternal, Leoric spat on the ground, his eyes blazing with hatred. "You're a coward, Cain. You want to live forever in a world of shadow? That's not living. That's a death sentence without an end." Cain's eyes flickered, cold and calculating. "And fighting for a dying world is better? We're delaying the inevitable. At least in the Twilight, we can be something more." Alara stepped forward, her voice filled with desperation. "There's still hope. We can't let her snuff out the light. We don't know what the future holds. If we fight for the sun, maybe we can save it. Maybe the world can heal." The witch's laughter cut through the air, low and haunting. "Hope? You think hope can save you? The sun is already fading, little mage. Even if you strike me down, the light will not return. The end is already upon you." Varian's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the tower shaking beneath them, could hear the groaning of stone as it threatened to collapse. This was it, the final moment, the last chance to decide. He looked at Cain, then at Alara, and finally at Leoric. Each of them stood at a crossroads, their paths diverging in ways none of them could have predicted when this journey began. "I won't surrender," Varian said, his voice steady but filled with the weight of his choice. "The light may be fading, but I won't give in to the dark. We fight for what's left of the sun, even if it's just a flicker." Leoric nodded, his grip on his daggers tightening. "I'm with you, Varian. We end this witch here and now. If the world ends, at least we'll go down fighting." Alara stepped forward as well, her eyes filled with a quiet, determined fire. "There's still a chance. As long as there's light, there's hope." Cain shook his head, his expression unreadable. "Then you've chosen your fate." With a swift motion, Cain drew his blade, and in an instant he was upon them. The battle erupted with the fury of unleashed storms, steel clashing against steel, the sound of metal ringing out like the death knell of the world. Leoric engaged Cain with savage precision, their movements a deadly dance of strikes and parries, while Varian turned to face the Witch of Dusk herself. The witch moved with an unnatural grace, her body flowing like shadow, the light of the dying sun swirling around her as she unleashed torrents of dark magic. Varian's sword met her power head-on, the force of their collision sending shockwaves through the tower. Alara stood behind him, casting protective wards and hurling blasts of arcane energy at the witch, her magic barely holding back the tide of darkness that threatened to overwhelm them. As the battle raged, the tower began to crumble. Stone shattered, falling into the abyss below as the very fabric of the structure tore apart under the strain of the witch's magic. The light above flickered violently, as if struggling to hold on, each pulse weaker than the last. "You cannot stop the inevitable," the witch hissed, her voice rising above the chaos. "The light will die. The world will fall into shadow." Varian gritted his teeth, pushing forward with all his strength. "Not while we still stand." Suddenly, a flash of steel. Leoric staggered back, clutching his side where Cain's blade had found its mark. Blood poured from the wound, and Cain stood over him, his face twisted in grim satisfaction. "Cain!" Varian shouted, his voice filled with fury. He charged, but Cain was too fast, disappearing into the shadows of the collapsing tower. Leoric fell to his knees, gasping for breath. "Finish this," he rasped, his voice weak. "Don't let her win." Varian turned back to the witch, his grip tightening on his sword. The light above was nearly gone now, the last remnants of the sun's essence fading into the witch's outstretched hands. This was the final moment. Alara raised her staff, her face pale with exhaustion but determined. "Varian, now, we have to strike together." Together, they surged forward, Alera's magic wrapping around Varian's blade, amplifying its power. The witch's eyes widened as she realized what was coming, but it was too late. With a final, desperate cry, Varian plunged his sword into the heart of the Witch of Dusk, the combined force of their strike shattering the dark magic that had held the tower together. A blinding light erupted from the witch, and for a moment, it seemed as though the sun itself had returned. The tower groaned, its foundations collapsing as the magic that had sustained it was torn apart. Varian and Alera were thrown back by the explosion of energy, crashing to the ground as the world seemed to tear itself apart around them. When the light finally faded, the tower was gone, reduced to rubble and ash. The sky above was dark, but not the impenetrable blackness of eternal twilight. Instead, there was a faint, flickering glow on the horizon, the last remnants of the sun struggling to survive. Varian struggled to his feet, his body aching from the battle. Alera lay beside him, breathing heavily but alive. Leoric was gone, his body lying motionless amidst the ruins. For a long moment, there was only silence. Alera sat up, her face pale but determined. "We did it. We stopped her." Varian nodded, though his heart was heavy. The witch was defeated, but the sun's light was still fading. They had won the battle, but the war against the darkness was far from over. As they stood among the ruins, watching the fragile light on the horizon, Varian knew that the world had changed. They had fought for the light, and though it still flickered, the shadow had not yet won. But the future was uncertain, and the path ahead would be long and perilous. The last light still remained, but how long it would endure, that was a question for another day. For now, they had survived. For now, the world still held onto the light.